Hello and welcome to this webinar on the Southeast Asia Energy Outlook. This is one of a series of webinars that we are doing for the new IEA World Energy Outlook 2017. Many thanks for joining us. We really appreciate that so many of you have taken the time to dial in today. My name is Tim Gould. I am the head of one of the two divisions that produces the IEA World Energy Outlook, together with my colleague Laura Cozzi, who heads up the Energy Demand Outlooks division. I am in charge of the supply side. The main voices that you'll be hearing today during this webinar are those of my colleagues Toshiyuki Shirai and Ali Al-Safar, who have led the work on this piece of analysis on Southeast Asia. It's first thing Monday morning, Paris time here, and it's the start of what is going to be a very important week for the International Energy Agency. Tomorrow and Wednesday, we have our biennial ministerial meeting. So the world's energy leaders will be meeting at the IEA, and it's symbolic of the changes underway at IEA that 3 of the countries that we'll be talking about from Southeast Asia will be represented at this meeting. So ministers from Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore will sit alongside IEA members, accession countries, and other association countries that include China, India, and Brazil, to talk about how countries can work together to meet the world's future energy challenges. So why Southeast Asia? Why this analysis? The reason is really simple. Southeast Asia is a rising force in global affairs in general, and global energy affairs in particular. And we'll be going into a number of aspects of that during this webinar. That's why we have returned to this region to update our Southeast Asia energy outlook with scenarios for energy out to 2040. This has been a strongly collaborative process with input from experts across the region. We've had staff seconded from Southeast Asia to help us within the team that produces the World Energy Outlook. So I'd like to say many thanks to those officials and researchers that provided their time and expertise throughout this process. The report itself was launched almost 2 weeks ago on the 24th of October at the Singapore International Energy Week. Many thanks to our Singaporean hosts for that. And the report itself is available to download for free from the IEA website. This webinar will last for a maximum of 1 hour. We're going to divide that time roughly into 2 parts. I'll give a few words of introduction, and then for the next 25 minutes or so, Toshi and Ali will talk us through the main findings of the report. Just to confirm that the slides and the recording of this webinar will be available afterwards on our website. And then after the presentation, we'll move on to a discussion, questions that some of which we have received already, but please feel free to submit other questions via the browser for this webinar. We look forward very much to hearing from you. So on to the presentation. And but before we get into the substance, I'd like to just give a few words of explanation about what it is that we do with this type of scenario analysis to 2040. You'll be hearing today about 2 main scenarios that explain our view of the energy futures or possible energy pathways for Southeast Asia. The main scenario is one that we call the new policy scenario. And this describes the direction in which today's policy frameworks are leading the region. And that includes announced policy intentions such as those in the nationally determined contributions that have been submitted under the Paris Agreement. This, as I said, describes the direction in which the region is heading based on those assumptions and those variables. And that doesn't make it a forecast, in large part because the governments in the region have the chance to change direction in the meantime. And so I just wanted to comment on some of the reporting that we've had of this report over the last couple of weeks, where it includes a phrase like the IEA believes that coal demand will be such and such in 2040, or that oil demand will be such and such in the future. I mean, the numbers are an accurate reflection of our scenarios, but the implications are somewhat misleading. We are presenting these scenarios not as us saying to the countries of the region, you know, here's the future, please plan for it. But it's rather a different approach where we say, this is the direction you're heading. You know, are you comfortable with that? And are you comfortable with the implications of that for energy security or for environmental outcomes? And because if the answer to that second question is no, then clearly there are options available. There are technology options and policy options available that allow governments and others to mitigate some of the risks that we see arising. And that is really the way that we would like to frame this report and also this discussion that we'll be having today. And to help, you know, with this framing of the choices available for the region, you'll also be hearing about an alternative scenario called the Sustainable Development Scenario. This describes where governments might wish to end up based on the goals to which they have subscribed. And we took inspiration from this scenario from the key energy-related components of the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda, in particular the need for determined action on climate change consistent with the Paris Agreement, a major reduction in the pollutants that cause poor air quality, and the need to achieve universal access to modern energy. As we shall see, Southeast Asia is making progress on all of these fronts, but also has some unfinished business. Before passing the floor to Ali, a few words of context on the current state of play in Southeast Asia. So you can see here a few of the reasons why this is an increasingly important region for global energy. Since 2000, strong economic and demographic growth has pushed up energy demand in the region by around 60%. But per capita primary energy demand is still only around half the world average, leaving some strong scope for further growth. But there are significant problems. Around 65 million people still lack access to electricity, and 250 million people rely on solid biomass for cooking. Gas production is flattening, and you have rising demand in recent years. So it calls into question for how long Southeast Asia can continue to be a net gas exporter to the rest of the world. And likewise, rising oil demand and declining oil production has increased dependency on imports to around 60%. And there are clear environmental aspects to this as well. Ongoing urbanization and reliance on solid biomass for cooking have made the issue of air pollution increasingly crucial in many parts of the region. And rising CO2 emissions remind us also about the vulnerabilities of Southeast Asia to the effects of climate change. Policymakers are getting to grips with these challenges, and there are new opportunities to put the region on a more sustainable path. All 10 member countries in ASEAN have ratified the Paris Agreement and are putting increasing emphasis on renewables and energy efficiency in their national strategies. And at ASEAN level, you know, we recall also the target for a reduction in the energy intensity of the region's economy by 20% to 2020 relative to a baseline of 2005, and an aspirational ambitious target for 23% of renewables in the energy mix by 2025. And in addition, many countries in the region are making significant reforms of their pricing, their energy pricing, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and removing fossil fuel consumption subsidies. These are all topics which we'll be coming back to. And with that, I'll pass the floor across to Ali to take us forward to 2040.
Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start my presentation by focusing on some of the global dynamics that we see taking shape in our outlook. And one of the main dynamics is that the geography of global energy consumption is changing. In developed economies in the US, in Europe and Japan, energy demand is increasingly decoupled from economic growth. And so we're seeing a reduction in energy demand. But on the other hand, in emerging economies in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Latin America, energy demand is growing quite significantly. But it is Asia where this is the most substantial growth. That's India and China and in Southeast Asia itself. These three regions account for around 60% of global energy demand growth to 2040. Southeast Asia alone accounts for around 10% of the global energy demand growth. So it helps the region move towards center stage in the global energy system. Now, specifically on Southeast Asia, we see robust growth in final consumption of energy being accounted for in a number of factors. The first is that the consumption of bioenergy decreases. This is mainly because of the fact that traditional biomass is gradually displaced by modern energy, including electricity and LPG. This is a story that is focused mainly on households. The second dynamic is that coal consumption is expected to grow under the current expected trajectory, but this is mainly in industry where blast furnaces for primary steel production is introduced in countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. For gas, well, consumption we're expecting to more than double to 2040, and this is driven by the increased use in the industrial sector, and this accounts for around 80% of the growth in gas consumption to 2040. And oil retains its position as the largest source of energy in the end-use sectors, as around 30 million passenger cars and 1.6 million trucks are added to the vehicle stock to 2040. But perhaps most interestingly, it is electricity that accounts for the largest growth in final consumption, and it more than doubles in this period, growing at a rate that is around twice that of the global average. This is mostly reflecting the increased consumption in buildings. This is where there is a rising ownership of appliances like air conditioners, fridges, TVs, all underpinned by rising urbanization and incomes. So this reflects a much broader global trend where we're expecting increasingly electricity to play an important role in the future of energy, closely linked to the increased digitalization of the energy sector. To meet this rising electricity demand, installed capacity more than doubles to 2040 to around 565 gigawatts. Notable here is Indonesia, where the capacity triples to around 180 gigawatts. And in terms of generation, based on the policies and plans that we see today, the relative affordability and abundance of coal in the region makes it the largest source of power by 2040, accounting for around 40% of the overall mix. Gas power generation also grows strongly by around 60%, and this includes small-scale gas turbines powered by LNG, bringing power to some islands in Indonesia and the Philippines. And this is an area that we focused on quite heavily this year, and that I'll be presenting later. Oil is almost entirely phased out, and what remains is mostly in the form of decentralized diesel generation to meet the needs of more remote communities and as backup generation for some industries. Nuclear plays a very limited role, and this essentially reflects solely the national plan in Thailand to introduce around 2 gigawatts of capacity by the late 2030s. But the other major trend is the rise of renewables in the region, and this is enabled by the significant cost reductions we've seen across the world. And as a group, renewables take second spot in the generation mix from coal. Many countries in the region have announced plans to boost renewables-based energy deployment. So we've got Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam have all introduced feed-in tariffs, and almost all the countries have set a renewables target. So as a result, the power generation from renewables quadruples by 2040, reaching a share of around 30% in the generation mix in the region. I've spoken in some detail about the increase in electricity demand and how it's met, but the one area that we have focused on in the book and also across our work in the IEA is that of energy access. How is it that we can bring access to electricity to the millions of people without it? In our view, a combination of political determination, new business models, and technology means that universal electrification in Southeast Asia is well within reach. And if we look at what's happened so far, the signs are encouraging as well. Since 2000, the region has made considerable progress in making sure that their citizens are connected. In this time, around 170 million people gained access to electricity, bringing up the regional electricity access rate to 90%. But there's still a lot more to be done. As Tim mentioned already, 65 million people remain without access, many of them in remote communities and islands. So for this study, we carried out a detailed geospatial analysis to answer the question, how can access be brought to those that are currently without it? And focused on the 4 countries with the greatest access problems. So that's Indonesia, Philippines, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So what did we find? First, that all countries in the region can successfully achieve universal access by the early 2030s. So accounting for population growth, this means that the region essentially has an additional 145 million electricity consumers in that time. But beyond this, what we wanted to do was to understand the least cost route towards universal access. So taking into account a number of factors, including population density, resource availability, and crucially, the likely changes in the cost of technologies and fuels over time. Factoring in these considerations, we found that almost 60% of those that gain access to electricity in this time do so through connections to mini-grid and off-grid systems, fed mostly through renewables. These technologies are particularly important in extending access to those in the most remote areas. The key thing to remember here is that the challenge of the past is not the same as the challenge of the future. A lot of the 65 million people that remain without access are in remote areas. So the mini and off-grid solutions are particularly important in these most remote areas, including, for example, in Papua, in Indonesia, where they account for most of the new connections, and in Myanmar, where they account for around 60% of new connections. This, though, should not detract from the fact that on-grid connections remain crucial to extending quality access to those without it, particularly in areas like East Java in Indonesia, which has a relatively high population density and is relatively close to developed areas. So over 1/5 of new connections in the period to 2030 come from coal-fired generators linked to the grid. Now I'd like to turn to the outlook for fossil fuel production and trade. Oil production in Southeast Asia currently stands at around 2.5 million barrels a day. The dependence, though, on mature fields and the depleting reserves means that production has been in gradual decline since the 1990s. And we're expecting this trend to continue throughout our outlook period, with production falling to around 1.7 million barrels a day by 2040. But at the same time, and as Tim alluded to, rising demand means that the gap that must be met by imports grows ever larger, meaning that the region needs to import around 7 million barrels a day by 2040. The prospects for gas are slightly brighter, and the region is expected to be able to maintain production at their current levels of around 220 BCM. The outlook, though, would be brighter still if progress is made in developing East Natuna in Indonesia, but this really depends on the ability to find a solution to high levels of carbon dioxide in the reservoir. But in the absence of this happening, we're expecting that the region turns into a net importer of gas in the mid-2020s. Perhaps more surprisingly, the region as a whole also becomes a net importer of coal. This hides the fact that Indonesia remains a prominent exporter, but as a whole, the region becomes a net importer. This doesn't necessarily reflect, as in oil and gas, problems with reserves, but rather a range of policy decisions to limit coal production and exports. And so the increased reliance on imported fossil fuels means that the import bill in 2040 reaches over $300 billion, with the bulk accounted for by oil. Beyond the financial costs, increased dependence on imports, such a degree, raises important questions for energy security. In the Southeast Asia Energy Outlook, we outline two main levers available to policymakers in the region to help alleviate these concerns. The first is increased regional infrastructure integration and planning cooperation, and the second is the accelerated transition to a more sustainable energy system in which energy is used more efficiently and renewables account for a greater share of the mix. But what will it take to bring about such a change? Investment is key, and I'm going to present just the headline numbers, and I'm going to pass to Toshi to give a more detailed explanation of this. But the overall difference in spending is relatively small, only around $14 billion per year to 2040. But this belies the fact that there's a relatively significant shift in the pattern of spending away from supply of hydrocarbons towards renewables and energy efficiency. The reorientation of investment brings a number of benefits. The first is that by virtue of reduced demand in transport, the region needs to import less oil, so saving around $180 billion off the import bill in 2040. This saving alone, almost entirely covers the cumulative increase in investments needed in the sustainable development scenario. Perhaps more importantly, the cleaner use of energy has perceptible benefits to human health, cutting by around 2/3 the number of premature deaths from indoor and outdoor air pollution. In other words, the shift towards a more sustainable energy system brings manifold benefits to energy security, to the environment, and to the health of the region's citizens. And with that, I'll pass to Toshi, who will talk a little bit more about the SDS.
Thank you very much, Ali. Following Ali's presentation, I'd like to cover the investment aspects of what scenario analysis. But before going to details about investment, I'd like to revisit our two scenarios, which Tim explained in the beginning, just to illustrate how different the two scenarios are in terms of energy mix. In our main scenario, which is new policy scenario, primary energy demand grows rapidly by 2/3 by 2040. Coal leads the way to provide about 40% of expanding energy demand by 2040. The other scenario, the sustainable development scenario, in this scenario, primary energy demand in 2040 is around 16% lower than the main scenario, underpinned by more stringent efficiency policies. The share of renewable is also larger, with enhanced support measures and further cost reductions in technologies such as solar PV and wind power. In this outlook, renewables make up about 40% of primary energy demand, and the share of coal is substantially reduced to 9% in 2040. And this translates into about a 50% reduction in energy-related CO2 emissions relative to the new policy scenario. By 2040, $2.7 trillion of cumulative energy investment is needed in a central scenario, which is around $110 billion on an annual basis. Of this amount, about $50 billion is invested in the power sector, which includes power generation and networks. This represents about 40% more than the level of power sector investment in 2016. The power sector takes the bulk of the cumulative investment to 2040 to meet expanding electricity demand, which almost doubles to 2040. In the sustainable development scenario, cumulative investment to 2040 amounts to around $3 trillion, which is about $125 billion on an annual basis. And this is around 13% higher than the central scenario. And here again, the power sector takes about half of the total investment at around $60 billion, which is 70% higher than the 2016 investment level. Cumulative energy investment in end-use sectors, which is mainly directed towards efficiency, increases by 50%. On the other hand, reflecting demand for fossil fuels lower by around 30% in the sustainable development scenario, investment in fossil fuel supply, mainly for oil, decreases by around 30%. In both scenarios, energy investment needs to increase over time, and as in a sustainable development scenario, the clean energy transition requires a ramp up in energy investment to 2040. Moreover, in the sustainable development scenario, the power sector changes gears towards more low carbon technologies, and investment needs to shift from fossil fuel power generation to low carbon technology, which is mainly renewable technologies. Now let's take a closer look at efficiency investments. In industry, an additional $3 billion per year of efficiency investment is needed in the sustainable development scenario. About 40% of this is for energy-intensive industries, such as steel, chemicals, paper, and aluminum production. The rest is for non-energy intensive industry, which includes a range of industries, such as electronics, cars, and other manufacturing. Encouraging efficiency in the non-energy intensive industries, especially for small and medium-sized companies, is very challenging as they often lack sufficient resources and capabilities to address efficiency. In the building sector, additional annual efficiency investment amounts to around $5.5 billion, and it is mainly directed towards efficient appliances such as air conditioning and refrigerators, which are the largest contributors to the electricity demand growth in the building sector. In transport, investment is needed for vehicles with higher efficiency, as well as for the vehicles using alternatives such as electricity. More than $2 billion of annual efficiency investment is necessary to improve efficiency of growing number of cars and trucks. There is room for the countries of Southeast Asia to strengthen their energy efficiency policies. In 2016, only 7% of final energy consumption in the region is covered by mandatory efficiency standards. This is substantially lower than the level of a worldwide basis, which is around 30%. While almost all ASEAN countries have efficiency targets, the degree of policy implementation varies considerably among countries. For example, some countries in the region do not have any energy efficient standards for appliances. Also, the adoption of mandatory fuel economy standards is very limited in the region too. In the sustainable development scenario, all countries in the region are assumed to implement effective efficiency policies, contributing to energy intensity declining by around 50% by 2040. In the power sector, annual average investment of around $25 billion is needed for power generation plants by 2040. Over half of this investment goes to renewables, which account for around $14 billion. But as coal plays a prominent role in the main scenario, the investment is also needed for coal-fired power plants, especially for efficient advanced coal technologies. The large penetration of renewables and wider deployment of efficient coal contributes to a decline of around 20% in the carbon intensity of the power sector by 2040. But this level still remains significantly higher than the world average. In the sustainable development scenario, the annual average investment of over $35 billion is needed for power generation, almost twice as large as the investment level in 2016. Around 85% of the investment in the power generation goes to renewables, while investment for coal-fired power plants is substantially reduced. In particular, in the sustainable development scenario, the investment for solar PV and wind power needs to be almost tripled relative to the main scenario. the net impact of reduced coal and increased renewables is the carbon intensity in power sector declining by around 75% by 2040 in this scenario. With this, I'd like to turn the floor to Tim.
Okay, many thanks to Ali and Toshi for that presentation of some of the key findings. I reiterate the invitation to people on the line to send in any questions that you have based on the presentation today or anything else that you've seen or read about this report. We have a few questions already that we will come to in a second, but before going on to that discussion section, I wanted to put some conclusions up on the screen, and we'll leave them there for the remainder of the webinar. And to go through some of the main findings, the main things we talked about during this webinar. So Ali and Toshi have described a region that will continue to grow in importance in global energy affairs, and that's really true whichever scenario we're talking about for the future. We've looked at a number of energy challenges. We've looked at multiple energy challenges in practice, but there are some reasons for optimism, particularly on the electrification front, as Ali was mentioning. And there are also some proven policies and technologies that can make a big difference. And among those, as Toshi was saying, there's a major opportunity to improve energy efficiency, to get prices right through subsidy reform. And of course, those two issues are related. And then to deepen regional ties via cooperation in the framework of ASEAN. We've talked a lot about investment. So we're looking at a requirement of more than $100 billion per year to 2040. Let's not underestimate the size of this challenge. You need to mobilize new sources of capital, engage with different financial institutions, including international financial institutions. But we've also talked a lot about the risks that emerge in our main scenario. Energy security risks with rising import dependence and import bills. Environmental risks with air pollution and CO2 emissions. So it's not just a question of the volume of investment, but also, as Toshi was showing, whereabouts this goes in the energy sector. In the sustainable development scenario, we show what it would take to move onto a different pathway that would lessen these risks considerably. And finally, I just wanted to emphasize that as the Southeast Asian countries look to their energy future, the IEA stands ready to work with them on data, on analysis, on emerging clean energy technologies, on energy security, on best policy practices, and so on. And these are all of the areas that we'll be discussing this week at the IEA ministerial meeting. With that, I move on to some questions, and a first one is in relation to oil demand. And we have a question from Hugh Lee talking about electric vehicles. So this is a topic that naturally comes up whenever the future of oil demand is mentioned, and you showed that we have this steady increase in oil consumption projected in our main scenario out to 2040. So to what extent is that affected by the rise of electric mobility? What are the expectations based on what we see today for electric vehicles? And are there other policy areas, whether fuel efficiency standards or others, that could really bend downwards that trajectory for oil consumption?
Thank you very much for the question. In the new policy scenario, we have incorporated many initiatives taken by the ASEAN countries, such as Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, with regards to electric vehicles. For example, Thailand envisages to introduce 1.2 million electric vehicles by 2036. So we incorporate these initiatives, and we predict by 2040, the number of electric vehicles increased to around 4 million, which accounts for around 6% of total passenger vehicle stock in 2040. As a result, so the impact on oil demand is relatively limited, and in our projection, oil demand for passenger vehicles continue to increase and grows by around 40% by 2040. But on the other hand, in the sustainable development scenario, with enhanced support to building up infrastructures and incentives to purchase electric vehicles, we predict that around 20% of total passenger vehicle stock would be electrified. But still, we see the continuous growth in oil demand. Thank you.
So, sorry, and if I may just add to that, electrification is one aspect of the strategies that we hear coming out of Southeast Asia, but one of the more prominent ones is the increase in the use of biofuels. This is seen as basically an alternative towards imported oil. It supports a domestic industry, and we have incorporated an increase in biofuels in our scenarios in both the NPS and the SDS, and that actually plays quite a significant role, so that in energy terms, by 2040, biofuels make up around 5% of consumed energy in transport. In the sustainable development scenario, this increases to around 12%. So electricity is one aspect, biofuels is another. One area that a lot more can be done on is efficiency. So we're expecting a large increase in the vehicle stock. So far, the countries in the region that we've spoken to haven't necessarily introduced the kinds of standards that are being implemented elsewhere, and so that's an area that can put energy oil consumption in transport on a downward trajectory.
Thanks very much, Ali and Soshi. There's another question coming in from Rizky Fazianto regarding the outlook for coal, and it's notable from the main scenario projections that coal continues to expand its role in the power mix. So why is that? Why do we see such a significant expansion still of coal in the region? What are the drivers for that? Why don't we see a more rapid switch across to lower carbon forms of generation?
So the main driver for coal penetration in the new policy scenario is coming from the relative affordability and the abundance of coal in the region. But as we wrote in the publication, there's a challenge to introduce coal-fired power generation, for example, for securing a sufficient investment. And this is a very much challenge for the region to secure rising electricity demand. But taking into consideration various challenges surrounding coal-fired power plants, in a projection, the share of coal amounts to around 40% in the power generation mix, which is 10 percentage points lower than the previous publication, which is published in 2015.
Sorry, and if I may add, that 10 percentage point shift goes almost entirely towards low carbon in this outlook, because we've integrated the NDCs now.
There's another question coming on the outlook for pricing policies. So fossil fuel consumption subsidies, the reforms that you mentioned. So how is that going? To what extent are the countries in Southeast Asia on the road to phasing out these fossil fuel consumption subsidies?
Yes, in fact, many countries in the region have made progress in reforming fossil fuel subsidies. For example, Indonesia gradually phased out electricity subsidies and removed subsidies for gasoline and diesel. Malaysia also reduced subsidies for gas for power generation, and recently Myanmar increased prices for electricity to reduce subsidies. And given the low oil price environment, there is a good prospect for the reforms to continue, but challenges remain, especially when oil prices go up in future, which tests the durability of the reform. As international fuel price goes up, the subsidy bill also goes up in the future. In our analysis, if countries in Southeast Asia cannot continue reform electricity subsidies, the cumulative subsidy bill to 2040 amounts to over $350 billion. So countries need to sustain reforms by introducing transparent pricing mechanisms that reflect changes in fuel costs, and also implement communication campaigns to increase public awareness to the need for the reforms.
Okay, thank you very much, Toshi. I wanted to return to something that I mentioned at the start, and the question has come in regarding the targets that ASEAN has set for energy intensity to 2020 and also for renewable energy to 2025. So how do our projections rate relative to these targets?
Regarding to ASEAN collective efficiency targets, in our main scenario, already ASEAN countries can effectively meet efficiency targets to reduce energy intensity by 30% by 2025. And also, that is also a case for sustainable development scenario. But with regards to the renewable policy target, which is around achieving 23% of renewable energy in the primary energy mix, in the main scenario, the share would be around 50%, so which falling short of the envisaged aspirational target of ASEAN countries. And also in the sustainable development scenario, the region still falls short of the envisaged target, and the number would be around 20%. So it comes closer to achieving the target.
So that begs the question in a way, if we are in our main scenario with a renewable energy share in primary energy of around 15% by 2025, what would need to happen in order to get up to 20% or up to 23% and to increase that share of clean energy in the region's energy mix?
Clearly, there's a strong need for increasing renewable energy deployment. For example, as Alice mentioned, there are only 5 countries which introduced feed-in tariffs to deploy more renewables in this region. And there are, in some countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, there's no clear policy framework to introduce renewable energies. So that is one thing. And also, the country needs to enhance the incentives to deploy more renewables.
It's a question about the role of traditional biomass in our scenarios. So you showed, even in the main scenario, that the share of bioenergy in final consumption goes down between now and 2040. And this presumably goes down even more in the sustainable development scenario, since one of the goals of that scenario is to introduce a full universal access to clean cooking facilities by 2040. So if traditional biomass, or the traditional use of biomass is largely then phased out in the sustainable development, what fuels, what technologies take its place?
That's exactly right, Tim. So, well, another component of the SDS is also, of course, air quality and the reduction of air pollution, and this is a significant part of indoor air pollution. And so, as you correctly mentioned, we have an almost full phase out of traditional biomass in buildings energy consumption, and a lot of this goes towards 2 aspects. First, a greater spread of electrification in households, so a displacement of traditional biomass by electricity, and also, perhaps a little bit more surprisingly, an increase in oil consumption, and this is basically LPG, so LPG for cooking in buildings. And so these 2 together, and of course a little bit of increased gas consumption in some of some households in cities, means that biomass is almost entirely phased out, accounting for only around 4% of buildings use in the SDS.
Okay, thanks very much, Ali, and thanks to Hussein Mutas for sending in that question. I'd like to move on to an inquiry from Mr. Ward Vandenberg regarding the mix of technologies that allow us to achieve full electrification, which, as you've noted, takes place in our main scenario. So in that sense, Southeast Asia is on track by the early 2030s to achieve full electrification. And the question is really, what is the role there of microgrids and off-grid solutions? Are we moving towards a situation where these are offered on a commercial basis? To what extent do they require, specific support, or to what extent do they rely on the interventions of non-governmental organizations?
It's an excellent question, and one of the key messages that we've tried to emphasize in our work is that the energy access or the electricity access issue in Southeast Asia doesn't have a panacea. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and so there are going to be areas that are going to require grid access. There are going to be other areas that require off-grid or mini-grid solutions, really depending on a range of factors which I outlined earlier. Now, coming back to the question, we have off-grid and mini-grid access basically being responsible for around 60% of new connections to 2030. So playing a very, very prominent role. This will differ, the commercial viability will differ based on circumstance as well. So what we see happening, for example, in Papua at the moment, is that PLN, the Indonesian utility, is having to take on most of these projects by themselves because they are probably at the moment not commercially viable for private investors. So PLN has basically made a strategy whereby they're trying to get investors involved in grid connections where the returns are more certain, and then themselves taking the initiative to extend some of the off-grid access and mini-grid access to the more remote areas. So to kind of spread the burden across the portfolio of projects in Indonesia. This is one way to do it. And I think the challenge now is basically to make sure that enough consumers are connected in certain areas, because a second phase of projects then could come in. And we see this already in places like Papua, where two of the things that are being done concurrently is trying to make sure that people gain any access through off-grid or mini-grid solutions in the interior of the island, and then in the coastal areas, we're seeing much more much stronger push towards a grid connection through solutions like the small-scale LNG. So effectively, this is a two-pronged approach to increase the quality of the electricity to those that are new consumers, and to make sure that enough people are connected in any case.
Thanks, Eli. Question on, we mentioned that regional integration is one of the policy solutions for Southeast Asia. So what's the prospect for power market integration in Southeast Asia, and what do you think that could bring to the region?
ASEAN countries have long supported the concept of cross-border power integration, and there is an initiative promoted by ASEAN countries known as ASEAN Power Grid Network. And broader interconnection offers various benefits, including increased energy security, increased access to energy, and also increased sustainability. And today, 9 cross-border interconnections with total capacity of 5 gigawatts are in operation, and many more are under construction and plans. To realize larger interconnection with the region, financial, institutional, and technical hurdles should be overcome. But with those challenges remaining, still it is encouraging to see the first multilateral agreements made under this program in this September, which allows 100 megawatts of power to be delivered to Malaysia from Laos to Thailand. Challenge also includes how to attract financial resources, achieving mutually beneficial terms in electricity trading, and also harmonization of regulatory framework. It is also important to have a harmonization in the power market structure. In ASEAN countries, only 2 countries, Philippines and Singapore, has a competitive wholesale electricity market. And the other ASEAN countries, the single buyer model, where a national power company play a dominant role, are very much prominent. So the harmonization of this kind of market structures is also an important element to further facilitate the integration of electricity in this region.
Sorry, can I just add one thing that we've recently seen an agreement by Malaysia to import around 100 megawatts of electricity from Lao PDR, and this is going to be wheeled through Thailand. And this is the kind of agreement that's encouraging in terms of wider integration of electricity markets, and this will particularly become more important as renewables deployment increases. So Lao PDR is one we're looking at increasingly because of the fact that there's huge hydropower resources that are probably too large for domestic consumption, and so are ripe for exports. And so, trying to make sure that that this is exported to where it's needed is always going to be facilitated by greater integration.
Thanks very much. I'd like to ask a question that came in from Unhoi Hu. We talked about that one of the main drivers for coal consumption is an abundance of coal resources across the region. However, if we refer back to the fossil fuel balances that you projected out to 2040, Southeast Asia became a small net importer of coal. Are these conclusions necessarily coherent? Why does the region then become a net importer if indeed it has this abundance of resources?
So the abundance of resources is there, and it's effectively two contesting kind of pressures. The first is that region-wide there is a call on coal because it is cheap and because it's easily importable. I mean, not only from Indonesia but from elsewhere. It doesn't require the kinds of infrastructure that you might need for gas. The move towards it becoming the region becoming a net importer is essentially reflective of what happens in Indonesia alone. What we've done is we've taken into consideration the recent announcement by Indonesia to limit its production to around 400 million tons, and then to focus on the domestic market. So Indonesia is effectively where what is responsible for the entire region becoming a net importer. So the cap on exports in Indonesia and production in Indonesia swings the whole thing towards becoming a net importer. I think this is consistent with the broader trend. I mean, coal remains abundant and it only becomes a small net importer at the end of the projection period. But at the same time, there are other options for the region to be able to import from.
Just to supplement his comment, our projection of the coal production is guided by Indonesia's policy to limit the production to 400 million tons from 2019 onwards. So our production and projection is not necessarily guided by resource constraints.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So one of the features of this kind of scenario analysis is the gap between our main scenario based on the things that we see today, based on the policies that are in place or those that have been announced, and the more ambitious trajectory that it would be associated with the sustainable development scenario. So a question from Anand Shukla to say, what could be the disruptive policies? What could be the things that would be needed, either on the policy or indeed on the technology side, in order for ASEAN to reach its targets?
There could be a number of things. I mean, having just recently visited the region, there are clear pressures in terms of things like local air pollution. And so one of the drivers could be what effectively drove China towards gas away from coal, or towards renewables and gas and away from coal, which is the fact that local air pollution is becoming such an issue that it creates an inertia towards trying to change the power mix, for example. One other thing that we haven't really mentioned today is, yes, there's an increased uptake of cars that's expected, but one of the things that we're seeing increasingly in cities across the world is a modal shift. So why do we need to increasingly put cars on the road? You know, are there metro systems that can be built? Are there mass transit systems that can be implemented that can help reorient the energy system in certain ways? So public pressure, either through increased pollution or increased congestion on the roads, are things that could lead to a shift towards a more sustainable energy system. The other thing we're seeing increasingly is a shift in the way renewables projects are rewarded. So we already mentioned that feed-in tariffs seem to be kind of the flavor of the month at the moment in the region, but worldwide we're increasingly seeing the shift towards competitive bidding for renewables projects that have brought the prices down quite considerably. And so with the increased competitiveness of renewables, that could just, you know, that could actually lead to an increase quite dramatically in the region as well.
Okay, thanks very much. We are almost out of time, so and we still have some questions on the feed that we have yet to come to. So we make a commitment that we will get back to those respondents by email and answered so that we've answered everything that's come in. I did just want to take up one question that was raised by Melissa Lott in relation to the sustainable development scenarios. So we have, as explained, three main pillars of this scenario. There is meeting climate change goals, there is large improvements in air quality, and there's also universal access. So the question that came in, you know, which of these has the biggest, meeting which of these goals has the biggest impact on the overall trajectory in this scenario? And the answer is really that it's meeting the climate change objectives has the largest influence, but none of them are irrelevant in the sense the choice of technologies, the way that investments are made are shaped by what seems to us to be a way to integrate approaches to all of these aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. We won't go into that in more detail today, but just to say that once the main World Energy Outlook is launched on the 14th of November, so in around a week's time, after that, where we will present more fully the global results of the different scenarios, and we'll be having a specific discussion on the framing and the outcomes of the Sustainable Development Scenario in a future webinar. So with that, it's now 1 hour is up. So many thanks to all of you who dialed in today. We really appreciate your interest, but I'd also like to pay tribute to our presenters today, to Toshi Shirai and Ali Al-Safar for their contributions during this webinar, but also their leadership throughout this project. Many thanks to you, and we look forward to hearing from you again on future webinars. Many thanks. Goodbye.